After growing up in Pittsburgh, moving away, then boomeranging back here for the last 25 years, I still watch the same local news channel I watched as a kid. Why? Because the weatherman from that station came to my elementary school every year. Today, one of the news anchors lives in my neighborhood. It's that simple. It also helps to explain why, when trust in nearly every other flavor of news is plummeting, trust in local TV news has been remarkably resilient. It's easier to have faith in people who live and work among us than in the talking heads who work for some mega corporation hundreds of miles away. Unfortunately, that trust in local news isn't translating into financial windfalls. The challenges of local media, from changing audience habits to cord cutting to the overwhelming power of Google and Facebook, are well documented. Facing all that, how is a small TV station in Pittsburgh supposed to survive, let alone compete? I asked that question today of our guest, Perry Sook, the founder, chairman, and CEO of Nexstar, the largest television station group in the U.S. Perry believes, and I tend to agree, that the only way local news can thrive is through greater scale. Perry and I talked about why local news is so important to the fabric of our country, why Nexstar's pending acquisition of Tegna represents a major step towards saving local news, and the outdated regulatory hurdles standing in the way. We also talked about our beloved Pittsburgh Steelers, the best part of a chicken wing, and why we're not entirely comfortable with driverless cars just yet. So thanks for joining today's newsworthy conversation with Perry Sook and me, the dumbest guy in the room. Perry Sook, it is great to see you. Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from the Nexstar World Headquarters in Irving, Texas, just outside of the DFW airport.
So you're second guest out of three from the DFW general area. As you know, we had Mark Cuban on a couple weeks ago, so lots of connections there. First of all, I'm glad to fill your dance card. I know you haven't really had a whole lot going on lately, so glad to put something on the calendar for you today. But thanks a lot for joining us today. Greetings from the home of the AFC North leading Pittsburgh Steelers. By the time this is published, we will have played the Browns on Sunday, and win or lose, will be still the first place Pittsburgh Steelers. So that's nice, although I expect we'll win. That's a bit of a segue, letting the audience know about your own Pittsburgh ties. Typically, we don't do, this isn't sort of a biographical interview format podcast. However, we're going to talk about local news, which is a big, obviously important and complex topic. But I do think I've always found your story so fascinating, unique, and your journey that led you to where you are. But also, I think it really explains the perspective that you have on the news industry as you've wound your way through that journey. So I thought maybe just we would start with you sharing a bit of that background, the Perry Sook origin story for our audience to help them understand how you've landed in the seat you're in today.
Well, sure. Thank you. Again, thanks for having me. My Mark Cuban connection is that my wife and I got married at the Mount Lebanon United Methodist Church, which is literally down the street from where Mark Cuban grew up. So we have our Mount Lebanon connection and now a Dallas connection. And I see him from time to time, but not often. My first job in radio in this industry was in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, famous one day a year, home of the groundhog. Decidedly, blue collar upbringing in Western Pennsylvania. And this was the only business that I ever wanted to be in. I thought at one time I wanted to be the next Bob Prince, doing play-by-play baseball for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and realized to get there, you've got to go to Charleston, then Toledo, and then maybe Altoona. And then maybe if you're lucky, you get to Pittsburgh. And that road was going to be, long and well-traveled. And took an interest in the sales side of the business. I did spend a few months as a TV journalist, not only in college in paid positions, but in Clarksburg, West Virginia, which is a TV market about the size of this office, I think, and realized from those modest beginnings that, as I said before, that on-air talent should not be applied universally to anybody that's on air, because I don't think I had the talent necessary to be successful in that arena. But went into the sales and management side of the business. Worked in Pittsburgh at WPXI, and in fact proposed to my wife on the helicopter pad at the old building, which overlooked the north side and downtown. So then we celebrated with dinner at the Red Lobster out in the South Hills. So very modest beginnings, and always cognizant of that, and that the vast majority of the folks that watch local television in our local markets, and we started in medium size and smaller markets, Scranton, Pennsylvania, Erie, Altoona, before we advanced on to Harrisburg and Philadelphia and larger markets. And so, you meet those viewers one at a time and share a lot of common values with, the center of opinion, the center of the country, and people that are just trying to do a good job, go about their lives, raise their family the best way they know how, and provide for them, and watch a little news and information and entertainment on television. So just remembering who our end users are and our audience is, I think from that beginning, I founded this company, Nexstar, in a converted Kresge's department store in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is about as far from the media elite as you can get, John. So if that gives you any kind of context or background, that's kind of where I'm coming from, and kind of how Nexstar's ethos started and developed.
It's also not just the direct kind of relationship or connection you had with the audiences, but kind of working in those diverse different roles within the business certainly equips you to lead it, to understand, whether it's a salesperson knocking on your door or somebody who's quote unquote talent knocking on your door, you've got a way to relate to them from having, sat in their seats before. So the big topic we want to tackle today is local news and local journalism, right? And I think, one way of asking the question is, how do we save it? Another one is, how do we make it thrive? And obviously one of the biggest things going on in your world right now is the impending acquisition of Tegna. So let's use that as sort of a stepping off point. Putting aside what it could mean for shareholder value and the business and all of that, I get. Convince me why it's good for the industry, why it's good for news journalism, and why it's good for audiences to see that acquisition go through.
Well, serving local communities and being able to do it well in this environment, and in fact, in all of media, it is increasingly a business of scale. I can't tell you how many stations over the last 30 years we bought from family operators who said, I just did a negotiation with CBS or with Comcast, and I don't want to go through that again because I operate in a single market and I'm getting steamrolled by the big players. And now you can substitute big media players with big tech and it's an existential threat. So, first of all, I think you need big and strong companies to be able to continue to invest in local journalism. And again, you look at who we compete against. It's, the FANG companies, right? The Facebook, the Amazon, the Apple, Netflix, Google, their market cap, their ability to take anything that they want, any business that we're in, and decide that they want to own it and dominate it. Very little we can do about that. But again, it's increasingly hard to remain relevant in a universe where, according to the FCC and the DOJ, I only compete with other television stations for advertising revenue and viewers, and I can only reach 39% of the United States population with my local TV signals, where YouTube can reach every screen in your house, right? The screen in your pocket, the screen in the den, the screen in the headrest of the car. But for some reason, I've been legislatively kept small. And so, the Tegna acquisition would be a continuation of what we've done. We currently reach 70% of the United States population through UHF discounts and what the current rules provide. This would take us to 80%. It would give us, we produce 330,000 hours a year of local news. This would take us to over 450,000 hours of local news. We employ more journalists today pre-merger and provide more local news today pre-merger than any other company in the United States. We have more journalistic boots on the ground than any other journalistic organization in America. And we think that's important. And we think that, people don't want ultimately their news to be delivered by Google, by Facebook, by Netflix via a chatbot of unknown origin and deliver news of unknown veracity. And so we think that there's a national interest in maintaining a free and independent press. And so we've been on the ground in Washington for half a dozen years, making this case and saying, this is where we're headed. And if you want to look at what an industry looks like if you take too long to deregulate, that's called newspaper. And when they finally got around to deregulating newspaper, there wasn't much of an industry to go back to. And I don't want to see that happen to local broadcasts. I don't want to see that happen to local news. So, for example, up the road from you in Erie, Pennsylvania, we own the ABC affiliate. It's a very fine local television station, usually the dominant news provider in the marketplace. We also provide news for the Fox affiliate in that marketplace. And so some would argue, well, you've eliminated a voice because you're running the Fox and the ABC news operation out of the same office, even though the times when the news is on the air is different. The style of the news on the Fox station versus the ABC affiliate is different. You use a lot of the same resources. It's like kind of publishing two newspapers off the same printing press, but it's not a loss of voice. It's preserving a voice or creating a voice on the Fox station that would not have the wherewithal to do that on their own. And in this industry today, in any market that you're in, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, New York, Los Angeles, total digital advertising revenue is about 4 times the entirety of all television and radio advertising revenue. So, for someone to say, well, you control all the TV revenue in Little Rock, Arkansas, I would say, okay, so what? I mean, that's roughly 12% of the total advertising revenue in the marketplace. So I don't think that's undue concentration. So we are kind of meeting the regulatory moment where it is, John, and we're trying to press for change by providing a need for change to allow our transaction to move forward, because I think you're going to see fewer companies, but hopefully bigger and stronger companies that can actually survive and dare I even think about, prospering, as you said earlier.
Well, when you talk about the impact that, for lack of a better word, big tech has had on news media and particularly local media, I don't think any of those companies would say that they had it out for local media, and it was in fact, many of them have made gestures, some earnest, some less so, to try to support local media. But at the end of the day, not only does their scale give them a competitive advantage in competing for advertising dollars, which is what funds all of this, but also attention is finite, right? And so we know consumers tell us they want local news. We see it in our data over and over and over again. But when it's crowded out so much by those other platforms, then there's only so much oxygen in the room, and and I asked that question. I said, "Convince me that this is good." You don't have to convince me. I'm a huge believer in both the importance of local news to democracy and to our society, but also a very big believer that this kind of consolidation and economy of scale is absolutely essential to it. Here in a city like Pittsburgh, which has not been a growth market for the better part of, probably most of my adult life, do we really need as many local outlets as we have when combining some of those resources and things could make for a more vibrant industry and serve all those kind of democratic objectives that we have. But so I want you to expand a little bit. You used your Erie example, I think was a touchstone into this topic. But in a world where, let's just say hypothetically, the Tegna deal makes its way through all of the traps, you'll have I think be in 132 total markets at that point. 35 of those markets, and correct my math if I'm wrong, will be markets where there is, at least today, currently a Tegna property and an Nexstar property. What does that look like in the new future, right? Where you've got those two broadcast, call letter stations in the same market. What's that look like?
Well, we operate a lot of markets where we derive an economic benefit from more than one TV station today, even though we can't own the second station outright. Now, those are not 100% efficient, but over in Scranton, we own the NBC station and operate the CBS station. And we have 2 studios, 1 big newsroom, and we produce different product for each of the TV stations. So what I don't have to do is have 2 separate buildings, and when the mayor has a news conference, put 2 reporters and 2 photographers in 2 different news cars and have them drive, to the scene and stand beside each other and shoot the same, B-roll, or cover the news conference from the same, press pool podium in the back of the room. So a lot of that is things that we do today. We call them virtual duopolies, where the ownership rules preclude us from owning 2 TV stations in those marketplaces today. But they're not 100% efficient. And again, we've identified, from where I speak here in Dallas, we own the CW affiliate. Tegna owns the ABC affiliate. There's no local news on the CW because we can't afford to compete in a market like Dallas with a CW affiliate standalone. So when we combine the two, they'll be in one building with, one set of, back office folks, and we'll be able to take the ABC News operation and expand their footprint and put, news on the CW at 9:00 because ABC is programming until 10:00. We'll be able to, when they go to Good Morning America 7 to 9 in the morning, we'll be able to program local news on the CW affiliate using a lot of the same resources. And so, we've identified probably a dozen markets in the acquisition just from our desk review where we can add more local news. And if you look at our heritage, when we bought Tribune back in 2019, we increased the amount of local programming on the acquired stations in those acquired markets by roughly 30%. And again, it's a big organization with more resources may be able to try things and do things that smaller organizations can't. So again, by consolidating, you're not paying 2 electric bills for 2 facilities, 2 sets of property tax and all of that. And so then you can focus on what our core mission is at the local level, which is to produce local content. That's our service to the community. And hopefully it's of interest to the community. And then we help local businesses sell things. I mean, that's our commercial reason to exist. And so I think that as an industry, we have to kind of get out of our own way of, well, are we doing that through connected TV or linear TV or a website or whatever? And the answer should be all of that. We have to meet the customer, which is the viewer, and the customer, which is the business person, using all of our assets and meet them where they are, whether it's at 4:00 on a TikTok video of a story that's trending or at 11:00 on a scheduled newscast that is very traditional. We have to serve all of the audience using all of those tools at our disposal. And it's just different ways of distributing what we're doing. But we've got to get out of the mindset that these are each silos. It's one organization producing content that should be amorphous and reaching the audience across all platforms.
Well, that's a perfect lead-in to my next question. You mentioned to me in a conversation recently that local news, local TV news, has essentially lost like an entire generation of viewers, right? That was, and all kind of coinciding with the advent of, certainly the explosion of the internet, and then the advent of social media, and all of this sort of battling for attention that you're fighting uphill against sort of these massive scaled tech companies. So you can disagree with the following, which is, in my opinion, trying to win back that lost generation would be a misallocation of resources, because I think it's a hill that can't be climbed. But the opportunity is to engage with the soon to be emerging new younger adult people, my kids of 18, 21 years old that are going to leave college and settle down in a local community, if maybe hopefully at least one of them comes back to Pittsburgh. How does the local news reintroduce itself to this younger audience? And I think you touched on it a little bit in terms of sort of reaching them where and how they want to consume content. But how are you thinking about that? Are we leapfrogging a generation lost in the hopes of gaining a new one with a fresh start?
Well, I would say that I think we did lose a generation of news viewers. It's probably, Gen Z, and part of Gen Y. We used to always operate under the misguided thought that, local news, people start to watch it when they have kids and they're interested in what's going on at the school, the city council, what the weather's going to be for the bus stop in the morning. That's all still true. But, when the generation got out ahead of the industry and said, I want to watch things in a different way and on different devices and at different times, just rebroadcasting your local news on your website wasn't going to attract anybody, because that's not the way that the generations Y and Z wanted to communicate, content, wanted to consume content. And so I think, I look right now, and I just got a stat yesterday that, our NewsNation content, NewsNation is our national cable news network, last month had 32 million views on YouTube. And, they weren't watching the linear channel. They were going in for stories and pieces of interest that were trending. Now, granted, somebody else's algorithm stacked them and served them to them. But I think that, we've got to look at that as a legitimate distribution platform and a distribution format. And I think that we need to employ our anchors and reporters to do different things. I mean, a piece on the evening news might get, locally a minute and a half, but, we've got an hour worth of interview content. So I think making that available in an unstructured format. We've launched connected TV apps across our entire company in the last 18 months. And my biggest challenge is to tell people, listen, you don't have to produce a 30-minute program for connected TV that has an open, that's properly lit, and you're made up and all of those kinds of things. I said, program an 8-minute or, program a 2-hour piece of content, but don't be bound by the structures and strictures of linear television. And it's an education project as well. I think our anchors, if they are passionate about a subject, should be owning a podcast on that particular topic. Now, there's very few podcasts standalone that make a lot of money, but if you have 5,500 journalists in the United States, as we do, and half of them are doing podcasts and they can all make a little bit of money, I mean, that can be self-supporting. It's worth putting the resources into that avenue of distribution of content when you've got that long tail opportunity as a company of our size would.
Well, I agree with you. Touched on a couple of things we'll get to in a little bit, NewsNation being one of them, and that's sort of the building content around the talent, or allowing the talent to create additional touch points from when they're not behind the desk or at the desk. Those are things I want to get to a little bit, because I have some thoughts on that I'd like to get your reaction to. But look, it's no secret that institutional trust in this country has been plummeting for the better part of 15 years. That's touching, of course, starting with politics and government, where trust is really at historic lows. Even trust in big corporate America, trust in science to some degree, and of course, trust in, quote, the media has been in a pretty strong state of precipitous decline. That said, one of the things that we track very closely in our data is what forms of news people trust the most. And the way we ask the question is essentially, which of these forms of media do you trust the most to deliver, quote, unbiased news? And one and only one format of news has increased or improved over the period of time we've tracked it, and that is local news. Now, understanding that it's a single answer we're asking people to choose, right? So that it could partly be the fact that local news is benefiting from the declining trust in everything else, right? But let's put the positive spin on it and say that it is the one area where the consumers retain some real and or romantic notion of unbiased access to information. You mentioned something earlier, and it was kind of a matter-of-fact comment you made. One of the maybe arguments against some consolidation in the industry is that you're going to reduce the, quote, number of voices, right? And that presumes that what people want from news is, quote, voices. And I would argue that they don't, right? Particularly in local. They don't want narrative and argument and point of view. They want facts, right? They want information. They want ground truth. And local news it appears to be the last bastion of providing that to consumers, right? So I think it's happening for a few reasons. One is the familiarity we tend to have, particularly if we're born and raised in a community where we've watched the same local news outlets our entire lives, right? I know I've joked to you before, like I watch the WTAE Hearst affiliate in Pittsburgh because when I was in elementary school, Joe DiNardo, the weatherman, came to our school every year. And that was just that sort of, and will occasionally see a person from the local TV broadcast at the grocery store in my neighborhood, right? It creates that familiarity, and with that familiarity, you get trust. What are your thoughts on why local news has been able to retain levels of trust that other news media has not?
Well, I think if you look at our job, it is to serve the local community. And I think you touched on something very important. Our local journalists live in the communities that they cover, right? Unless you live in New York, you're probably not going to see David Muir or Diane Sawyer, at the grocery store. And even then, probably not.
Right.
But if you're in Abilene, Texas, could you see, Bob Bartlett, our anchor, or, the weather personality in that marketplace, the meteorologist? They have to go to the grocery store. They don't have security details and things of that sort. So I think, these are people that live with us, that do what we do. And I think there's an inherent trust in that. I think that is the moat around our business that we need to capitalize on, is that we're with that consumer, that viewer, that last mile journey in the local community. And the content we produce reflects that local community and is only about that local community. Where I get most incensed when I see pieces on national, international news in local newscasts. I say, well, there are places for that, but it's not here. You should be reporting on city council, little league scores, high school, activities, those kinds of things that are truly local. And again, there is very little, if any, conscious bias at the local station, that I have a political point of view and this is my conduit to get it out there. If anything, we're hiring reporters that are, 2 years out of Ohio University or the University of Pittsburgh, and there might be some naivete, well, I hear what this official is telling me, but, what are they not telling me? And that's the area where, but we're there to just try and deliver the news and the weather and the sports and not put any kind of spin on it. And again, the market votes every night with their eyeballs, their feet, and their advertising dollars. And if we're not in touch with the sensibilities, opportunities, and challenges of a local community, we're not going to be very economically successful, and we're not going to have viewership. So the agenda is to serve the public interest, serve the local community, do it well, do it better than anybody else in town, and hopefully economic, rewards come from that. But there is no attempt to go hard right or hard left and pick up because if you do that in Wheeling, Steubenville, you're going to lose half of your audience, and our job is to try and reach everybody at the local level. That's why it's called broadcast.
Good point. We lose sight of the literal definition of broadcast sometimes. One of the byproducts of, or reactions, I think, to this declining institutional trust is the extent to which people are filling that trust void or finding trust through, I would say, connections with people and personalities. One, the most talked about would be your so-called, social media big I influencer. I also think about sort of like a small I influencer, which maybe isn't someone who's famous, but somebody whose opinions about things I trust, maybe a friend or a family member on social media. I'm personally a person. When I look even in the news media that I consume, particularly print or whatever, written, text-based media, I tend to gravitate more toward individual writers than I do maybe the publications they work for, right? I feel like if I've read them enough, I begin to build trust with them and their point of view. And so we know that consumers are more and more gravitating towards, say, personalities than they are corporate brands. But that's a bit of a huge, well, not even a bit. It's a huge cultural shift in news media where historically kind of the masthead and the call letters were king. And the individual reporter, the individual writer was always sort of to take something of a subjugated seat relative to the big brand. You did touch on this a little bit earlier about sort of enabling your talent to, say, go from behind the desk to having a podcast and so on. How else are you thinking about that? How are you empowering your talent to be able to build relationships with their audiences when they're not on the 6 to 7 o'clock time slot on TV?
Well, I think we have to start with first, nobody ever goes home at night and says, I want to watch a Nexstar television station, or I want to watch a Hearst television station. It's, I want to watch News 8 in Tampa. I want to watch, Action News in Philadelphia. And it's generally linked to the personalities. It was Jim Gardner in Philadelphia. It was Joe DiNardo in Pittsburgh. And so I would push back a little bit. I mean, they were part of a brand, but the connection is made with the people. And again, I think one of our greatest strengths is, I tell people all the time, we don't go to red carpet premieres, but boy, if there's a new grocery store or an auto dealership opening up in the marketplace, we'll be there, both news people and salespeople, to cover that as a local event happening in our community. So I think, again, getting people out into the local community to mix and mingle with, you meet your viewers one at a time. And so that has to be a part of our mission, not only from a service perspective, but it is also from a marketing and as you said, brand perspective, that, if you're going to be local, you have to truly be local and be in the local community. So, but that's our greatest strength. An influencer can be in one place at one time, and there are lots of aggregators of content, but there are very few professional producers of local content. And I think of ours, I think we do that better than most, meaning producing local content is professionally produced. Now, I do think that the opportunity, the way in is, we talk about user generated content. There are all these citizen journalists out there with iPhones, and the more that we can make what we do interactive, it's like, here's what we see. Now, here's also things we see on the ground from people that have submitted their video. And it's not just send in your pictures of the snow on the back deck, or, pictures of funny things that happened, in your daily life. It's got to be a little bit more, thoughtful than that, but even that is kind of a start. In to the extent that we can somehow make the discussion more interactive, I think then it becomes a lot more sticky.
Completely agree. Look, as if you're not trying to tackle enough in saving, preserving, and growing a thriving local news industry and navigating the largest acquisition in your industry's history, all of that going on. As if you don't have enough on your plate. 5 years ago, you mentioned a few minutes earlier, you waded more heavily into national cable news, just almost exactly 5 years ago with the launch of NewsNation. I've had Chris Cuomo as a guest here with us on this podcast in the last season. As you know, I've been on his show several times. I'm a fan of fan of the network. I've written quite a bit about it, in fact, and I think I've even heard from a few friends that I've turned into converts. Chris talks about this all the time, and I've heard you kind of talk both publicly and even privately with me about it. One of the big sort of vision, or among the big visions and hopes of NewsNation, was to sort of capture and appeal to what is arguably, statistically, the much larger part of the country that lives in the middle of the political spectrum, not sort of the 20% on the left or the 20% on the right. Obviously, that's a virtuous goal, full stop, but also an incredibly difficult one in a world where people tend to increasingly want to seek out information biased in their direction. They won't call it biased, but they tend to want to seek out content that speaks to their political sensibilities. And at the same time, you've got a much larger media and big tech ecosystem or enterprise and algorithms that favor content from one extreme to the other, right? And sometimes it's because that content is going to speak to a person with that biased point of view, and in other cases, it's going to enrage people with the other point of view, right? So they kind of win either way. So you and Chris and the NewsNation team have set out to kind of withstand some of those not only withstand, but maybe overcome those big macro trends in media and in our population. I want you to talk a little bit about why you saw that as not just an idealistic goal, but a potentially great business goal. And how's the experiment going? What are you learning from it 5 years in?
Well, thank you for this opportunity. What started as a counter-programming strategy when we inherited WGN America that had reruns on it, basically, and the cable operators and satellite operators said, I've got 99 basic cable network on my system that do rerun entertainment, and there's not anything different about WGN America. You don't have the Cubs anymore. You don't have, anything like that. So I really don't care if I carry it, but I sure don't want to pay for it. And so I said, I've got to develop something that people would be willing to pay for, because one of the assets we inherited was a fully distributed basic cable network that basically no one chose to watch reruns of Blue Bloods and because they could get that on 3 other channels in the same day. So I said, let's step back from the business we're in. What are the assets we have? One of the assets we have are 5,500 journalists running around the country in 40 states, around the nation. And I said we could use that as kind of the foundation to build a national news network. And I was inspired, quite frankly, not just because I'm here, because I've told this to other people, by something that you wrote a while back. This was several years ago. You did one of your Saturday morning pieces saying that, 82% of America can basically agree on the abortion issue. If it's framed this way, and not everybody's going to agree on it, but I said with this kind of a bandwidth, 80% of the country would be in agreement on those basic tenets. And you said you can't get 82% of the people to agree on, whether the sky is blue. And I'm exaggerating, but and that was inspiration for me, saying, we're really not as different as people portray, right? And so if you have this 60, 70, 80% swim lane down the middle of people that are just kind of in agreement about life and things like that, then we need to serve that. And we purposely put the headquarters of NewsNation in Chicago, so it's not in D.C., it's not in New York, it's not in Los Angeles. We said we're going to serve the middle of the country, the center of opinion, and cover stories that other people don't. And because we have the ability to do that, and by the way, our hidden strength is when there are floods, when there are tornadoes, disasters, East Palestine and all that happened there, we had reporters on the ground knowing the local officials, knowing the street names, being able to cover it live before anybody else could charter a jet and send somebody in from New York to, quote unquote, cover the story. And so I think that those are the enduring strengths of what we were able to offer. When I started the network with what I thought was a big $20 million pre-launch hullabaloo campaign, NewsNation launched 5 years ago, and 11% of the country had ever heard of it. Now we're up to about 40% of the country acknowledges having heard it. And if you go to the news viewership pod, our surveys tell us that it's closer to 60% of the folks that watch news, have an interest in news, have heard of and know of NewsNation. So often pleased, never satisfied. And that's 5 years. And when you look at MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, they have anywhere between 25, 35, and 40 plus year head start on us. And I'm very pleased at the progress we've made. I'm proud of the content we put on the air. We're so serious about the being accurate and unbiased in our reporting. We have hired a rhetorician that used to work at the Vatican. So you can imagine how every word, comma, punctuation mark is studied and there before anything is released. And she will come to me oftentimes with a piece of copy from the Associated Press. And people think, well, they're unbiased, they're down the middle, and a sea of red ink of unsubstantiated comments, something that is really an opinion, not a fact, a pejorative adjective, and so it's very pervasive and so easy to have unconscious bias, but we're really serious about it, and the real challenge is to make sure that balanced is not boring, right? And so we go at it different ways. I think our news coverage is down the middle and consistent. We're in East Palestine. We're still reporting from East Palestine. We're on the border every day. We're covering, we have people on that call from both parties that call us up afterwards to say, you know what, you gave me a fair shake, and that's all I can ask. You didn't give me softball questions. You asked some hardball questions, but you gave me a fair shake, and you gave me the ability to answer the question without you becoming the story and inserting your opinion and trying to play gotcha journalism and things like that. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do. We've developed personalities. We've got Chris Cuomo, we've got Elizabeth Vargas, we've got Leland Bittert, Ashley Banfield, that anchor in our primetime, kind of a different content when the news of the day, much has been adjudicated. We own a publication called The Hill, which is primarily a digital publication serving the DC audience. We've developed a Hill television show, not only on Sunday morning, but also a Monday through Friday version of that, trying to expand the bandwidth of our offerings. And when we covered the Charlie Kirk funeral, we basically just put it on. We didn't dip in and out. We covered it and just let the American people watch and decide what they wanted to think about that. We doubled the ratings of CNN and MSNBC combined. And it's a 5-year network. So people are recognizing that we are a place to go for local news. We staff on the weekends using our resources of our stations, but also we're in local news, all day long on Saturday and Sunday when many of our competitors are in taped programming. And so we were in Butler, we were live from Butler when it happened, and others scrambled to keep up with that. And so, we just have to continue to build on this. And the good news is the company has the financial wherewithal to continue to be able to support the development of this. And what started as a counter programming strategy, if I'm idealistic and hopefully not Pollyanna about it, could become one of the defining legacies of this company I started almost 30 years ago, NewsNation, and perhaps might even change the way we talk to one another in this country, over time. And if you talk to Chris Cuomo, he said, don't react to the game. This is the game, and they want you to take the bait. They want you to be enraged. Who's they? Okay, it's the lunatic fringe, if you will, on the very far right and the very far left. I call it lunatic fringe, but it's like, which is maybe 20% of the audience, 20% of the opinion, but they've hijacked the agenda. And, Chris is trying to break through that. Leland is trying to break through that. I was in Washington, D.C. not too long ago. My first meeting was with a Democratic congresswoman who went on for 5 minutes about how conservative NewsNation is. And my next meeting was with a Republican who went on for another 5 minutes about how liberal the network was. I said, well, if we're an equal opportunity offender, that may be that we're kind of doing our job that we've assigned. But it's very hard because there is unconscious bias everywhere. And they say, well, if I heard it on NBC or ABC, it must be okay for me to talk that way in the local marketplaces. And we're as serious about that. Being unbiased, and not to go on too long, but if you look at Ad Fontes or Media Guard or whatever, these independent rating agencies that rank news in terms of originality of content and unbiased, our stations and NewsNation and The Hill are right down the middle of the fairway in terms of not showing, an undue amount of favor to, the left or the right. And that's our mission statement locally. And, we're here to call balls and strikes, and that's our reason to exist. And if we do our job well, nobody knows what my politics are or what anybody's politics are that are on our air. They're just doing their job and trying to call balls and strikes and get more calls right than wrong in a given day.
I was laughing throughout that commentary, Perry, because first I've had some not heated, just I would say lively conversations with Chris about some of this over the years, the sort of the game. He'll often give me a hard time if I try to empathize with people on those extremes. I don't agree with them at all, but I try to empathize in as much as trying to understand where all of that stuff comes from, because I don't think it's in our natural state to see the world the way, and so much of that I think has been manufactured and manipulated and taken advantage of by people who make money by creating that rage with those people. But I'll just say again, it's incredibly virtuous effort you're undertaking. And it's super, super hard. They said we didn't go to the moon because it was easy. We went to the moon because it was hard, right? And so it's hopefully it's not hopefully, it's a worthwhile effort that I hope you will succeed in achieving. And I say all the time when I write stuff, like if I get angry replies from both sides, then I know I nailed it, right? Like if my point of view pisses off people from the left and the right, then I guess I did something right. So, and I appreciate you referencing. I'm always thrilled to know when stuff that I wrote stuck with someone, particularly, I think you and I kind of, I guess, quote unquote, met by way of my Saturday email. Somehow you ended up on it and we became pen pals through that. And so which is I think a great segue. As you know, reading that publication every week, I always end it with a handful of fun and frivolous poll questions that I was just talking to Mary on our team earlier this morning about how these are captains of industry like yourselves, and very famous and big and successful executives and lots of other folks as well. But we're always stunned at how many people take the time to answer those questions every Saturday with, lots of other things drawing at their attention, how many people choose to answer. So I love to end these with some fun questions just to end on a light note. So I'm going to start with the first one I pulled up for you. Do you collect anything?
Yeah, two things. One is I'm into high-end mechanical watches,
Okay.
things that can be hand wound or watch wound, and so I have a collection of those. I just like the artistry, the craftsmanship, the beauty of it. So probably spend way too much time, according to my wife, and money on that hobby. Also, I grew up a car guy, so I've got, a 6-car garage and every stall is filled, even though there are only 2 of us in the house. And so, those are two things. It's not an expansive or, any kind of a, braggadocio collection, but I do like driving different cars.
Well, 67% of Americans consider themselves collectors, at least as a casual hobby. So we find our ways. One of mine, which you'll appreciate, is I collect trinkets or memorabilia from Pittsburgh Steelers bars I've visited all over the country and the world, which, as you know, it's hard to find a city where there isn't at least one. I've been to one in Lisbon, Portugal. Yeah, it's probably the furthest. I know there's one in Rome. Anyway, so I have a pretty cool collection of things I've often, because those bars are maybe owned by somebody from Pittsburgh, they're willingly giving me a pint glass or whatever it might be, or a shirt. So that's my big hobby of collection. Next question. Of the following, Bull Durham, Field of Dreams, Major League, and The Natural, what's the best baseball movie?
Oh man, it's almost a dead heat between Bull Durham and The Natural. Natural is one of my all-time favorite movies. Bull Durham, just because of the story of that journey, and
it's funny as hell.
Those are both outstanding baseball movies in my opinion.
They're all good. I'm probably partial to Field of Dreams. I don't know why it just hit me and we just lost Robert Redford, R.I.P. on The Natural. Number 1 is Field of Dreams. So I'm in the not majority but plurality, and The Natural and Bull Durham are pretty much tied. So actually interesting how kind of dispersed or distributed the answers to that one are. Would you feel comfortable riding in a self-driving car? And have you yet ridden in a self-driving car?
No and no.
Definitely in the majority there. 65% of people say, no way, no thanks. I know they're increasingly prevalent in particularly like Northern California and a few other places, but I think the industry's got a long way to go to get people comfortable with being in a car they're not in control of. This is one I love because it's pretty divided. When eating chicken wings, which part do you like best, the flat or the drumstick?
Drumstick.
Me too. Slightly more popular. I thought when I looked at this, I thought it was going to be overwhelmingly more drumstick. But there's a lot of people. Actually, my wife and kids both prefer the flats. I don't know why. I just like being able to eat it with one hand. It's way less messy and not having to tear it apart or make a mess out of eating it. But yeah, Americans, well, basically 28% say they like both equally, so like they like a variety, but otherwise drums and legs are about 40% more popular than the flats. I have a friend who order wings and just order drumsticks, and I didn't know you could do that, but they will. So Americans are divided.
Lying if I said I've never done that before. So
just ordered it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a target-rich environment. There's more meat on the bone. I think it's
absolutely, and again, way less messy to eat. Particularly like at a function or something like that, where you're walking around talking to people. You want to have that free hand. Okay, arguably the most important question I've asked you today, and I have a somewhat provocative opinion on this one. Who is the best head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers of all time?
Listen, I grew up in the Chuck Noll era. In fact, lived at Upper St. Clair and saw him at restaurants more often than not when I was working at Channel 11 in the early 80s. It's hard to beat Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin is no slouch. I think if I had to pick one, I probably would say Chuck Noll. He built the foundation for what we are and where we are as a franchise today. Obviously, the Rooney family had a lot to do with that. I've got to spend a little bit of time with Art, and he continues that ethos of we're a lunch bucket team, and we're going to win on defense, And that's the ethos of Pittsburgh. And so I would say that Pittsburgh, loves offense, but man, do they appreciate a good defensive stand and, a good defensive hit and, probably outsized to other team fans that I'm around from other cities. Obviously living here in Dallas.
Well, first of all, Chuck Noll is the overwhelming choice. 70% of respondents choose Chuck Noll. And again, as you say, it's kind of hard to argue with it, but I do, and I've been in this argument quite a lot. My answer is Bill Cowher, more because of the era, coming into the era of free agency. I mean, the guy took Neil O'Donnell to the Super Bowl, for God's sake. Got AFC championship games with Cordell Stewart, almost got there with Tommy Maddox. I think he dealt a much more difficult hand to play with. And look, let's not ignore the fact that when asking a survey question of who's the best head coach of this football team of all time, that we only get to choose between three, right? That's one of the most amazing statistics. And there are many about the Steelers. The fact that since 1970, we've had a grand total of 3 coaches, when some teams can have that in one full season. So everyone, I always get asked when I tell people I'm from Pittsburgh, they say, "Are you a Steelers fan?" Like, yeah, of course I am. Like, if you were blessed to be born in this city, why would you be a fan of anything else when there's so many tortured fan bases out there? So, well, Perry, I do love our occasional banter about the Steelers, but I also really love getting into some of these hardier topics with you. I really admire the things you're trying to do. I'm very much rooting for you with the Tegna initiative you're undertaking, because I really do believe there needs to be more scale and more financial wherewithal to support local news, and that's really the only way I can see us getting there. So I'm rooting for you there. Very much rooting to see NewsNation continue to grow because of what it can represent about all of us. And I really appreciate you. I joked earlier about you not having a whole lot going on. Obviously, I was being facetious. You've got enormous things on your plate and lots to keep you busy. So I really appreciate you taking a little bit of time to chat with me today. Hope to have you back sometime.
Thank you, John. Appreciate being here, and go Steelers.